Howdy, 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 everyone. I think the plan today, actually, before I get into it, I'm jumping the gun. I'm getting ahead of myself. Can't be doing that. We got a rhythm to things, get ease into everything. We know how things go. Got to start. I got my tea. Back with some Dorian Earl Grey. I would take a sip, but again, way too hot. I make it like right before the stream, so it'll last me a bit. Usually about 45 minutes. So back up with water after that. I think what I want to do today, because yesterday was a lot. Yesterday got me riled. It's a lot going on. Not to mention, I do have plans a little bit later. I think what I want to do is talk a little bit about competitive debate. It's something that some people have mentioned being interested in. A picture of Dorian Gray. Yeah, I mean that would possibly last me the whole stream, but oh my, that's so much caffeine and sugar. Uh, maybe I'll make some more iced teas. I make them every now and again, but it's so hard to find, or at least with what I'm looking for, it's hard to find a tea that I want to make as an iced tea, and because of that, try to make it very infrequently so that I don't go through it too terribly quickly. Especially because a lot of the teas I like for iced tea are not so strong. They tend to be fruit and herbal based, so you need a lot more of the actual pieces of tea. Like, you get however many ounces, but you need more of that volume to make a strong enough pitcher and therefore pot or pot and therefore pitcher. So you go through it so quickly. So I try to chill on how much I use there. That said, summertime, it's getting pretty warm. It'd be rather appropriate to have a bunch of iced tea. Just roll up. I still wouldn't want to drink a pitcher. That's just so much. In any case, I've heard people talk about, both in the comments and people I know personally who watch, an interest in the debate stuff. Just not really having much experience with it. Usually, it's not the kind of thing you encounter very much. It's kind of new and interesting. And I think people don't have much of an idea of what competitive debate looks like. Often, like a lot of things, it's portrayed in media, but with the purpose of telling a story, not accurate representation. And I figured it'd be cool to talk about. We mentioned it a little bit yesterday. I was debating. I was going back and forth whether I watch a Sarah Zed video about this. My understanding is she did competitive debate and has some videos talking about it. I think we'll do that tomorrow. Not that there's uh, a particular reason to avoid it or anything. Just I wanted to be a little bit easier, breezier today. And my guess is I'm gonna have some differences with her, not not because she's wrong. I don't know what she says about competitive debate, but because there are lots of kinds, and different places do different kinds of debate and have different structures and expectations, and so my experience is likely to be different. And so I figured, well, let's talk about what my experience was and give people a little bit of an idea of what debate looks like, or at the very least, what my experience of debate was like. So I debated mostly in high school, a little bit when I went to community college, but it was kind of tough because there wasn't much of an established team. Uh, there are a few kinds of debate, and I'm going to start with what I didn't do. So we'll hop on over to my React screen. I hate that I have to reassign this every time because when I minimize it, OBS loses track of the window. Um, maybe I'll just bite the bullet and start going to a complete monitor capture instead. Well, this aside, we don't really need this. So, instead, there are a few kinds of debate. What I have generally found to be the most well regarded is policy debate. Now, policy debate focuses mostly on, it intends to simulate what policy argumentation is maybe not expected to look like, but might look like, just in the sense of it's supposed to be giving you a structure and format to what debating policy will be. Presently, it is a lot more accessible than it used to be, and that's part of why it wasn't really an option for me when I was in high school. Policy debate, as should be the case, requires an absurd amount of evidence gathering, and I wonder if I can find a picture. Uh, you would, Oh no, I do want debater. Don't correct me, Google. That's what I wanted. Well, that's my fault. I agreed to the correction. Yeah, so you need a ridiculous amount of evidence for because if you're talking policy resolutions, the topics that you'll be talking about are often have multiple parts, are very detailed. The expectation is that you have not just it's not just an answer to a question, do you think this or do you think that, but what is your proposed solution? What policies do you think would be good given the set of circumstances that are laid out? I don't know that much about it because I didn't do it, but this is just from what I've seen. And so it used to be, let me shrink this monitor down, this capture down, because we don't need the zoom in anymore. It used to be that you just needed these tubs and tubs and tubs of evidence because you have to justify your position and then also have reasons why the other positions are incorrect, and not from a philosophical level, but from a policy standpoint. Maybe what your opponent is suggesting is something that the data doesn't back up the credentials. Like maybe they're saying, we should do this policy instead because of these circumstances. Well, you need the evidence to demonstrate, like, no, based on these statistics from this institute, yada yada, etc. This is why the problem you're illustrating doesn't exist or isn't that much of a problem, so on and so forth. And so you'd have to have all these tubs and tubs and tubs of evidence, and all of these are filled to the brim with paper. Um, you can see just how much well, I guess that's not a great example, but like you can just see how much evidence is inside of these, like how much um, paper has to go into each of these tubs, and people are carting around. Like this was a pretty average number of tubs, these 6 tubs here. Sometimes people would have, you can see these two people have 8 tubs. This guy has a lot, but it looks like it's this is probably not all what he's carting around at a debate tournament. And people would have to cart them around literally on these hand carts at debate tournaments. Hey, Galit, we're just talking about competitive debate. I just wanted to, share a little bit, and that's what we're doing today. And so people would cart around these tubs, and it would be really funny because, well, you're seeing people here who are likely in college doing this. Policy debate definitely is a collegiate debate format as well. It was very funny watching, 14-year-olds who are still very much in the middle of puberty and still grow. Like they're small people pushing around these mountains of documents on these hand carts all around a campus. Okay, well, there's a lot of stuff that is. I'm glad we got something because a lot of these are just not what I'm looking at. And rifling through these, and they have to be well indexed and all this stuff. The reason I mention this is this kind, this amount of paper. It's not. It's like you have to make photocopies or you have to print them, and across multiple, even one team, this is a lot of stuff to print, and across multiple teams, which a school would usually field, it adds up. And so my school just, at least the debate team, didn't have the funding to support people who wanted to do policy debate. So it was never really an option on the table. That said, I don't think I missed out. I think I'm much happier having done the kind of debate I did than policy debate. I think I would not have liked policy as much. I just want to talk about this is probably, well, maybe not probably. I would expect most people who are talking about competitive debate to be talking about policy. And there's a lot of really funny stuff about policy that I guess I'll talk about because I'm just John on. We're just chatting today, and I might as well give you the whole thing. All right, how many times did I click on these? I clicked on these a lot. Yeah, so policy debate, like every other kind of debate, a has a speaking structure. Policy debate is a two-person team versus two-person team. So it's a 2v2 debate. It's not just you. You also need your teammate, which is an extra added, like, scheduling thing, and you need to have someone you can work well with. I've heard policy debaters speak talk about their partners in a very, like, you would expect, police partners to talk about each other in this way. Like there's kind of a bond I've noticed from policy debaters. If anyone has ever done policy debate in chat, I doubt it, or watching this has done it, and you can speak to what it's like having a policy debate partner. I've heard it like speaking very reverently about the other person because you rely on each other, and you have to be able to count on them to do certain things, and that's kind of built in this structure. Which I'll go over in just a second. Policy debate also very long. You can add these up, and you'll see. So there's uh, affirmative construction. So I'm not going to go over it again. Affirmative is just in agreement with the position or proposing the positive claim, whereas the negative is the negation, right? My understanding is in policy, the negative cannot merely negate. They have to have an opposing policy. Now that policy could be, I think, simply doing what we do now, just maintaining the status quo. That could be a counter proposal, but they can't simply say no, not that, which is part of why these speeches are so long. You see, there are four constructive speeches. You see first affirmative, first negative, second affirmative, second negative, alternating of 8 minutes each. So that's 32 minutes of information, and these are expected to be, as I understand, completely without rebuttal. You are supposed to be laying out your case, and I'm not exactly sure. I would assume that there is kind of an understanding of what kinds of information should exist in each constructive and what parts should be. But my understanding is you don't yet start rebutting each other, and in between each one is 3 minutes of cross examination. Uh, then Oh yeah. Competitive debate. It's not this free form thing like you see. No. Every minute it's you have I used to have one, but I mean I long since lost it. Competitive debaters by egg timers because you need them to time your speech. As soon as that time's over, you're stopped. And now you will get hand signals. So that usually in a debate round, I'll just bounce around. Maybe I should back up, but like no, I'll just bounce around. In a debate round, you will have the two debaters or the two teams, a judge who is making notes in the elimination rounds and the high, like once you cut to top 16 or top 8 or whatever, you usually have multiple judges, and you have a timekeeper. The timekeeper, especially in the Swiss rounds, which is the basic structure of a tournament, is usually some number of rounds of Swiss style matchmaking. I'm not going to go into that. You can look it up if you don't know. Sometimes a round robin structure for very small tournaments. Uh, and also extremely occasionally double elimination. But for the most part, Swiss and then a top cut to determine the finalists and the winner. And in the Swiss rounds, you don't always have a timekeeper. Sometimes the judge is doing that, but you are capped. When the timer goes off, you will likely be allowed to finish your sentence so long as it doesn't go on and on. You usually get a couple of sentences, just finish the sentence and don't start another one. But that's it. You can't just be like, well, I need 2 more minutes to make my case. I don't care. You get this much time. And so while you can rely on the timekeeper, it's often really, really important to monitor yourself more than what the timekeeper will tell you. They'll give you minute markers. They'll say, okay, you have 5 minutes left, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then like 30 seconds, 15 seconds. Sometimes you don't get the 15 seconds, and they have to be on it. If they're paying attention to what you're saying and not to the timer, they might forget. So oftentimes it'll look, I guess, a little like this. A debater will be speaking, and they'll have an egg timer in their hand that they're checking constantly, because maybe you're like, oh, I'm halfway through my case, but I'm 15 seconds or more likely like or like 30 seconds slower than I should be. Maybe pick up the pace. This comes up a lot in particular when you get to these rebuttals where you don't have the opportunity to have practiced your case. Like normally debaters will practice their reading their case within the time allotted. They don't often get to the point where they memorize the whole thing. It's not really worth doing. It's a lot of information, like 8 minutes of memorization, and you won't have one case throughout the entire year. I think policy does, but other debate formats don't. And memorizing your 8 minutes is not really worthwhile. You might end up remembering a decent amount of what you say, but you're not gonna like try to get every word down. It's more, you get used to saying it a lot, and maybe by the end of the season of whatever topic you're using this case for, you'll have a lot of it mostly remembered, but probably not. It's not really how this goes. However, you can at least practice saying it in the correct time. In rebuttals, that's not really the case, and this is where policy develops a cultural how do I put this? Maybe a stereotype. It's not even really in a bad way. It's just it has its tendencies. So I want to put you in the position of a first negative rebuttal. You have read your opening, which was 8 minutes. Your opponents might have said something that have responded to this, not necessarily through direct argumentation, but maybe what was in their constructive comments on, just because these things kind of work this way. Sometimes you'll say something and your opponent was ready for that kind of thing, or what they said had some bearing. You could, even if they didn't connect it, you would think have some bearing on what you said. But you have 32 minutes of stuff to talk about, and you have 5 minutes. Like, really let that sink in. What would you do? And your responses to these aren't just a counter argument. Often they need to be sourced. Maybe the source is in your constructive speech, in which case, I'll get to where to start when we talk about Lincoln Douglas. That is one issue that we have at the very least solved. Well, maybe not solved, but we have really good tools to have solutions to. But that is one question, of course. Yeah, where should you start with this? But you also, like, when you have your counter arguments, if the source for your counter argument isn't in your speech, in your previous speeches that you can just reference, you might have to read new ones. Remember, I'm just gonna have the tubs open because just as a reminder, you might, during these intervening periods, be rifling through these tubs for information. And yeah, so that seems really natural, right? Yeah, I see Galit in chat. In 5 minutes, you really have to choose what you want to focus on. That feels like a very natural reaction. But debate works a little bit differently. There's a concept in debate that I've mentioned previously. I think it's the same in policy, but it's definitely been the same across the couple of debate formats that I've done. The concept is that silence is consent. This does not apply anywhere else. Please, nobody take this out of context. But in debate, if you don't respond to what your opponent said, it is assumed that is because you don't disagree. So you might want to ignore the things that aren't super important, but you can't. In fact, if you were going to do that, the only real tool you have is to lump it into some other argument as being related or addressed in a similar way. So you have 5 minutes to go through 30 minutes. I'll round down a bit. 30 minutes of information. What do you do? The solution is something that debaters call spreading. Spreading is talking at a rate of speech where you can get out all of your thoughts in that time. And let me tell you, it does not remind anyone of what great orators are expected to sound like. I'm gonna see if I can find a video, but I want to paint the picture and like explain to you what you might see in a video before we get there. So they're going Mach speeds with how fast they're talking. It's to the point where an untrained ear won't be able to pick out the words. I've said it on a policy round before, and I was barely able to follow when they were spreading. Then the opponent can waste your time that way. Well, yeah, so I will hold that thought, chat, because I will get to that and when I get to my stories of what was happening when I did debate. But yeah, that's a really important really important thing, and it does happen. In policy, a lot less. Sorry, just to be for anyone who's not reading the chat. Basically, the question was, can't you waste your opponent's time by laying out this huge cavalcade of nonsense, and they have to respond to everything? In policy, that's a lot less possible because people are prepared to spread. People are ready to do this. They'll speak it. I'll try to emulate it. Where I can't emulate the actual doing it, but what it sounds like, where it's just, and like it really just sounds like they're just going. Like I said, I'll try to find a video where you can see it in action. On top of that, because you have to get through all of this, some like tics just tend to develop. I don't know if there's a particular reason for it. Maybe it's to get into the rhythm of things. One thing when you're spreading is that you are trying. One of the is that breathing takes time, and in this kind of context, that's actually pretty relevant. So minimizing the amount that you breathe is pretty important. So you're going to try to say as much with one breath as possible and breathe in for taking as little time as possible. So you'll have this. So that's part of it. On top of that, you get into the rhythm, possibly because of the breathing, where people start to rock back and forth as they're speaking. And on top of this, just because everyone has these ticks, you're also flipping through your pages of notes as you're doing this, and with one or maybe both hands, you're spinning pens and stuff. I can't really do it with my right hand very well, but you're spinning pens and stuff, and it is just the funniest thing. Coming from outside of policy, watching policy debaters just so let me see if I can find a video. It is so funny, but like it's just you can see how it's you can see it's one of the first things. You can see how it just comes up. Let me see. Okay, I haven't seen this video. Let's see if it's
about a quarter of the 1%.
This sounds about right.
Setting the economy at a free fall world producer recession oil prices differently than it did 15 years ago. Tend to go up, stay up through a spike field. We have a solvency mechanism for inflatable SPS. This goes away. Economic benefit and science discovery of the United States is overcome. Uses scary scenarios to shock the public, make action more popular. Jaworski evidence.
This is pretty accurate to what I've seen from policy debate. These are probably policy debaters. The video says it's at 350 words per minute. I would not be surprised. I want to add in, so this is already what a rebuttal has to look like, right? You already need to be doing this some amount of the time, which means that you need to know how to do this at any time. So as I understand it, spreading started to be a thing. I don't know when. It might have been before my time. I don't know how ubiquitous it is. Starts to be a thing in the constructive arguments. Which means now it's not just 32 minutes of stuff, it's 32 minutes of stuff at this speed.
I'm a 12th grader at Lexington High School. I've been involved in the policy debate team for all 4 years of my high school experience.
Yeah, that seems to get into like what's going on with it. I'm gonna skip it because I think I've covered what we need to for this. I don't want to get too much into policy because it wasn't what I did for a lot of reasons. I preferred what's known as Lincoln-Douglas debate. I can't spell. Lincoln-Douglas debate is supposed to have been modeled off of the debates between Lincoln and Douglas in the 1800s. I forget what the first name of Douglas was, but yes, Abraham Lincoln. These were very famous debates that were going on, if I remember correctly, on the campaign trail. But I'm not 100% sure on that. You can look into that on your own. Oh, here it says right here. In 1958, there was a Senate race in Illinois between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, and these were pretty famous for being like kind of noteworthy debates, like kind of legendary in their. Yeah, no, it is crazy fast. They were pretty well known for being really cool debates. I don't. Oh, okay, so back then the first speaker spoke for 60 minutes, the second a 90-minute rebuttal, and this is kind of how we get these more long-form debate formats, but of course Lincoln-Douglas debate now is not this long. It is shorter than policy debate by a little bit. Policy, I didn't do the math. We can add it up. We have 32 minutes of constructives, and you are expected and encouraged to use all of your time throughout all sorts of debate. It's just kind of a waste if you don't. You don't get to save it for later. You only get it right now. You might as well get out your thoughts. And if you don't have enough to fill the time, one, get better at having enough to fill the time, and two, that means you get a little more leeway to speak more slowly and more persuasively, as opposed to just getting the information out. Which, for what it's worth, policy is more about getting the information out than something like Lincoln Douglas. And we'll get to another format. But so we have 32 minutes of constructives plus another 12 minutes of cross-examination. So you're already up to 44 minutes plus 20 minutes of rebuttal. That's 104 minutes. And then in total, you'll have 8 minutes of prep time for each team. So that's another 16. So we were at 104. So 120 minutes. No, sorry. I think I did my math wrong. 32 plus 12 is 44 plus 20, 64. Sorry. Then plus another 16 is 80 minutes. So an hour and 20 minutes. And this is, excluding the little bits of, okay, you finished your speech, then you walk over to sit down. Then we start the timer for prep time. Then, take a few minutes, take a second or two to walk up. There's a little bit of fluff added on. You can expect the average round of policy to be an hour and a half. Lincoln Douglas debate is closer to 45 minutes. It's not quite as long. The speech times are. Oh, there's more of a breakdown then. Where's the. Oh, here's the breakdown. So you have 6 minutes for the affirmative constructive, then a 3 minute cross examination from the negative, 7 minutes for the negative construction. This is also sometimes called the first negative rebuttal because, as I mentioned yesterday, the second half of this is expected to be a rebuttal. There's a 3 minute cross examination, 4 minutes for the affirmative to have a rebuttal, 6 minutes for the negative, and 3 minutes for the affirmative to close out the debate. This adds up to, if I remember right, 42 minutes, especially because each side. Oh, they've changed the prep time. It used to, when I did it, it was 3 minutes per person. So, and remember, this is one-on-one debate. This is not teams. So we have 6, 9, nice, 16, 19, 23, 29, 32 plus another 8 minutes. So it's 40 minutes all told. So it is a bit shorter, about half the time. And the expectations are different. The expectation in Lincoln Douglas debate is that it's supposed to be more philosophy debate, while a policy topic might have a very detailed resolution that has like 6 different aspects to it. I never really learned to read policy resolutions. That's why I'm not that's why I didn't present any to you. Lincoln Douglas debates might have something like resolved, this House believes that the United States should spread democracy overseas. That was the first resolution that I ever had to debate. And while that even a little bit ventures into what you might call policy, because you might say, well, if we ought to do it, then we need to figure out how. The how is kind of a different question. The expectation is that we're not supposed to be talking about how, but whether or not it would be a good thing in theory. I'm gonna go over some of the terms we use to talk about these speeches because I'm going to accidentally use them. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, the affirmative, you're not going to get it. So the affirmative construction we called the AC. The negative construction, it was called the NC, but because the expectation was that there was a rebuttal, I often heard it called the 1NR, the first negative rebuttal. But it's either NC or 1NR. Both mean the same speech. The first affirmative rebuttal is the 1AR, then either the NR or the 2NR. It depends on what format they're using, but the NR will never mean the first negative rebuttal. If they're referring to the first negative speech as a rebuttal, they'll say it's the 1NR, not just the NR. So while that could be confusing, because of how things end up working out, it ends up not being. And then the 2AR is the second affirmative rebuttal. A few things you might notice about this is Oxford Union that style? I don't actually know. Let's. I'm not actually. I don't know what kind of debate they use, but maybe I would be a little surprised. Oh, is this the like public speaking type? No, probably not. No. Okay, I have seen some of these. No, this is not the same debate. This is not the same debate style. It might have the same. It might have similar expectations in that you might be expected. It might be expected to be more on philosophical grounds than concrete policy grounds. But no, it is a different kind of debate. Most forms of debate, you have to remember, most forms of debate are being adjusted on the fly. It's just competitive debate needed to have a formal structure so everyone would be keeping to the same thing and doing the same thing in a way that could be evaluated similarly. You're not going to see very much of this outside of that. And most of the time, that's why when people portray debates either in media or even if they try to emulate it by doing their own debates on stage, it's not going to look anything like this. Yeah, just because that's not what people think of debate as less structured and less I don't know what the word I'm looking for is here, less rigidly defined maybe than this. But thinking about things from a competitive debate standpoint does affect you a bit, so I wanted to talk about it. You'll notice a few things about this timing structure. First, the affirmative speaks more times. The affirmative gets 3 speeches, whereas the negative gets 2. And to compensate for that, their speeches are shorter. They have a 4-minute speech and a 3-minute speech. However, if you add up the times, it's actually the same amount of time for both sides. They have the exact same amount of time to speak, just like we saw in policy, though with policy, each speech was very clearly the same amount of time. Nobody got more instances of speaking. Here, the affirmative does. And there are some unique pressures that we've already talked about because of this breakdown. It's actually a little weird to me, by the way, that cross-examination is inserted here like this. When I was taught it, we don't usually write it down because it's not really a full speech, and so it feels weird to see the 1AR not in the middle. I expect it to be in the middle, since it's the third of 5 speeches. So the 1AR is the Lincoln Douglas debaters' real only instance where spreading becomes a thing you start to think about, because you have 4 minutes to talk about not exactly 13 minutes worth of stuff, but basically closer to like 7 to 7.5 minutes worth of stuff. Because remember, the expectation in the 1NR is that probably about half of this speech is rebutting the AC. So, uh, so like you have this instance of like kind of needing to spread a little bit. And there's been some amount of discussion about this, and what you already mentioned in chat has come up where you said, okay, then the opponent can waste your time that way, giving you a bunch of nonsense to respond to. At the very end of when I was debating in high school, there was a tendency coming up to break a little bit from what cases used to look like in order to capitalize on that very phenomenon. And so I guess I should talk a little bit about what cases will look like in competitive debate. Uh, I just want to document it real quick. Go to docs. Sure, give me just a new blank document. So a so a Lincoln Douglas case should look vaguely like this, irrespective of what side you're on. First, the resolution. You just want to state it so it's known. This is less for the debaters and more for just in case you get a judge who doesn't really know what they're doing there. But you're going to want to state what the resolution is. Then you're going to want to get into definitions. The affirmative has the majority of the burden here. They should be, if they don't define their terms, it's more of a problem than if the negative doesn't. Sometimes the negative can just roll with whatever the affirmative wants to say the definitions are, or if you just don't disagree, you skip reading your definition that might be for, so maybe you can say, when it comes to the resolution I suggested, I'll just put this at the top. So you might have the resolution might look like something like resolved. The U.S. ought to spread democracy to other countries. As a note about this, this was my debate topic because this was 2003. So this was being discussed like, hey, should we be doing this? This was like very topical, and part of why it's so memorable. So maybe you just defining like democracy is something that's important, and I think it would be. And if the negative just doesn't disagree, they might just skip their definition for democracy, and that's fine, right? They're just basically saying, sure, that's fine, I agree with that. So then you have your definitions. You'll have your primary value, which we discussed in our concepts, right? This is the thing that is going to be guiding. Oh, it's moved around. Right. This is something that's going to be guiding why you have the answer that you do for what you're talking about. Maybe freedom is a thing. That one came up a lot during this time, as you might imagine. You'll have your value criterion, and you'll have like an explanation as to why the value criterion leads into the primary value and why it's both necessary and sufficient. Another thing that we talked about. I don't want to. I'm trying to walk a fine line here, so please let me know if I stray too much to one side or the other. I want to give an idea of what competitive debate looks like, but I don't want to give a full like lesson on how to do it because I don't think that unless you find that particularly interesting. I more just want to talk about what it's taught me. But if you so if I stray too far into all right, this is how you make your via criterion. This is how you do this part. Let me know. I might accidentally start getting caught up in that. Please chat. I'm asking for a little bit of help on that one. But once you have these two down, now you can get into your case and what your points are. And normally it's structured in a particular way. You have your contentions. A contention is just a main argument. So this might be something like it's good to overturn. It's good to give people access. Like people should have the right to self-governance, and democracy is the way to do that. Like that might be a contention. That might be one argument you have, and then the second argument might be like, we make more money from doing it. Maybe that's a bad reason, but that could be your next contention. But within each contention, you'll have subpoints, and these subpoints are not necessary. But if your contention has multiple reasons why this will be the case, then you will need subpoints, and then you have contention 2, so on and so forth. This is actually a solution that I was talking about before when you were asking in chat, like where you start. This actually solves that problem pretty well, or at the very least can help you solve it. You don't necessarily. There are times where it's really important to go out of order, and you might need to spend 2 minutes of your rebuttal at the outset talking about contention 2 because it's that important. That sometimes happens, but you can have an idea of where to start and keep track of where everything is. This is something we would do 2 things to help ourselves and, more importantly, the judge keep track of what we're doing. The first is what we call a roadmap. This is generally done before your speech. You're even encouraged to say just a quick roadmap before my time starts, because this is just a helpful well, maybe roadmap, but it's just a helpful piece of information for people to follow you, where you'll say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to, for example, start with contention 2, then I'm going to go I'm going to go over the affirmative case, then the negative case, or whatever order. And usually you'll refer to it going down the line or like down the page if you're just going to do things in order of like, okay, let's talk about the primary value, then the via criterion, then the contentions, and go in order. The second thing you're going to do to supplement that is something called signposting. When you get there, you say that's where you are. You say, okay, on to contention 1. And now there should be no confusion about what you're talking about. This is largely for the debater's own benefit, but it's good for everybody. I like that this is simultaneously something that you will do to help you win, because if the judge can follow what you're saying, it's more likely they'll be able to understand why you're making better points. But also, it's just good for the conversation. Your opponent isn't going to get lost, and they're going to be able to respond better, and you're going to be able to actually encounter each other. You're not going to have as much of what we've already seen in our debate reviews of people just talking right past each other, what we call 2 ships in the night. I know it's a very common phrase, but it would come up a lot in debate, of just not responding to each other and talking about kind of different things. Part of what helps with that is a structured case, signposting, and road mapping. So from there is where I get to what I was about to talk about in reference to what you were saying about wasting time. There was a bit of a tendency to break from this case structure in favor of a different structure. One thing to note is that most subpoints are going to, and like every contention ought to have, and most subpoints should have, what we would call cards, but are just basically quotes or sources. There might be, ships of the night is very frustrating. There might be, maybe I'm gonna say that, maybe I'm saying like the consent of the governed is important, and so democracy is good, and therefore we should spread it. Maybe that's my contention, my contention 1. Maybe I'll have a quote in there for someone like John Locke, who expresses why the consent of the governed is so important. It should speak to what you're talking about. It's kind of like essay writing in school, where you should have a quote that speaks to what you're talking about. The expectation is these quotes will be much longer. You expect usually about a paragraph is the expectation, because they should flesh out at least a little bit why this is the case, and then you provide additional analysis to explain how this gets there. In large part because sometimes a philosopher in particular might spend an entire book making the point that you're trying to make in 45 seconds. So you have all these cards. There was a little bit of a break from this because I think it happened in part because people realized that the cards were a very useful way of referring to different parts of the argument. I don't have to say subpoint A if I can just say, hey, in response to your Locke card, referencing your quote from John Locke in this example. So a lot of cases started to have a different structure where instead of this contention setup, instead you'll have card A, card B, card C. You'd still have the value criterion, primary value definitions, all of that stuff. But in the contention portion, you simply, here's my card, here's my analysis. Here's the next card, here's the analysis. Here's the next card, here's the analysis. Well, part of the problem, at least from how I looked at it, is that this actually makes you a lot harder to follow. If I hear you read contention 1 and then I just miss subpoint A, but I do hear subpoint B, I know I've missed something, and in my cross-examination, what you're encouraged to do is the first thing is clarify anything you missed. And so if I hear subpoint B and I don't hear subpoint A, or even vice versa, because there shouldn't be a B without an A, or sorry, there shouldn't be an A without a B either. You should, if there's only subpoint A, you don't need subpoints. You should just have a contention, and you can clarify all that stuff because it's clearly laid out. But if I just read, here's my Locke quote, here's my Rawls quote, here's my Rousseau quote, how do you know? How do you know if you missed the second one? How do you know you missed it? You don't really have a way, right? Maybe you could ask, like, could you go over what each of your cards is? Maybe that would be a solution. It's not one anyone I was aware of thought up when this was becoming more of a thing. Coupled with this, a lot of people started engaging in what I'll call Lincoln Douglas spreading. It was not policy speeds. People were not doing this. It wasn't quite this fast. But it was fast, especially fast for what Lincoln Douglas was expected to be. Lincoln Douglas is expected to be understandable. There is more of an emphasis on being able to be a good speaker and explain things in a way. It's supposed to paint in your mind the idea of, Socrates and Glaucon discussing these ideas and debating with each other to come to conclusions. It's supposed to evoke that kind of feeling, and doing so means, like, you should be engaging with your opponent, and you shouldn't have so much information to go over that you need to speak this quickly. In fact, there is an expectation that no new evidence ever gets added after you're done with your opening speech. Once you're done with your case, you shouldn't be quoting anyone else. You shouldn't be citing any more statistics. You shouldn't need to, because your argument should be philosophical and logical. You should be able to say, well, yes, that is something that was said, or a statistic that is true, but it doesn't bear into this for whatever reason, or it's less important than what I'm talking about, or there is a philosophical, or there's a logical problem with what you derived from that information. You should be arguing you should be going to the arguments and not the data. We shouldn't be arguing data here. And so, there's less of an expectation to speak quickly, but people started doing this in conjunction with this format, which meant that people were piling up a lot of information that could very easily, remember, if you don't talk about it, it's considered unaddressed and agreed to. You could easily let something slip through your fingers and just lose the debate to that. This is a very effective strategy if your goal is winning, but I had serious problems with it because I thought we should be trying to have the best arguments. We should be trying to conduct the best debates and interact with each other the most, to the point where I even wrote something that's called an overview. I won't get into this too much, but it's basically an argument against the totality of your case in an overarching way. It's called an overview, where I wrote an overview with the basic idea being, if my opponent's doing this, they're not debating. They're trying to avoid debating, and therefore the win should go to the person who is debating and not the person who's doing this. most people didn't agree with me at the time. I came to find out later that with a different impact, and if you remember, impact is like why it matters to us. Uh, with a different impact, it was in use a little bit after I graduated. I don't know how successful it was, but at the very least, it was making the rounds, and people were talking about this idea. So I felt a little bit simultaneously vindicated and unheard of like, so I was right. So I was right, and no one listened to me. Oh, sorry, I keep bumping my monitor. Uh, so this was kind of a thing, and I feel like I'm a little off topic, but I just wanted to address the questions that were coming up. Yes, this is a real concern. This happened, and as to my knowledge, there wasn't like I don't know if there was a successful solution to this issue. I don't know if it's still in practice or not. But this is so yeah. Back to what we were talking about. The first AR is the first instance where spreading becomes a thing that you're supposed to think about, and you really shouldn't do it, but you might have to pick up your pace, and you might have to like skimp out a few arguments. Maybe you have to lump things together. This I think is the weakest part of the debate structure is that you have just a little too much to go over, and just a little too little time. Some of the solutions to this are pretty effective. One, you can front load some of your arguments in your cross examination. You can set the groundwork. You can let your opponent walk through the logical process that you're going to lay out. You might start, if you have a 3 point, if you have like A leads to B leads to C and D is why you're wrong, you can ask them to lead A to B and B to C, and then you can leave the last two parts for your argument so that they feel like you're expressing an argument, but you laid the groundwork in a different set of time. You gave yourself a little more time here. You might think that it's actually a worse issue in the 2AR, and it was for me for a while until a coach from another school, one who actually, despite not being my coach was not very good, who let me in on a little bit of a secret. No one's talking after you. You don't have to do that. He didn't put it in those terms, but basically the idea for the closing speech should be to draw everything up. In fact, I found it was much more effective to slow down, to say, okay, we've talked about a lot. Let me give you the summary of what happened here. I assume it's the same in policy debate, but in Lincoln Douglas, the last two speeches should include what are called, is it victory conditions? Is it win conditions? I forget the exact term, but they basically your reasons why you think you won the debate. In the 2AR, you should. I found that you should, or I was taught, and I agree that you can really that can be the only thing you talk about. You can ignore everything except why your opponent thinks they should win, and then your reasons why you think you should win. And because no one talks after you, no one can say like, "Hey, you didn't address this thing or that thing." Your opponent's already told you everything they didn't talk about as their victory points. Maybe that was what it was. No, I don't. Doesn't sound right either. Um, everything they didn't say is why they should win. Doesn't matter. If they didn't, you can just kind of skip that stuff. So it's kind of nice. I really like this ended up being my favorite speech to do because it's very calm. It's very relaxed. You get to slow down, kind of like set the mood for the room in a way where you can say, "Okay, let's talk about what's going on. Let me give you my final reasons and kind of summarize and wrap up." This was a really cool thing to do, and talking about it has made me a little bit wistful for doing it. And yeah, like you say, quality, not quantity. In the previous portions, you kind of have to deal with the quantity because what's going to matter is a little up in the air right now. Maybe the negative, maybe in the 1NR, there was a really important something that we spent a lot of time on, but by the 1AR, it didn't matter anymore, or we found it was more important to talk about the ramifications of that or how it connects to another point. Instead, you can just talk about the things that we've decided matters here. Now, there are huge problems with this kind of debate. One of them is that there's not really that much back and forth. If you notice, I mean, it does seem like there's more in policy because there are so many more speeches. It's about the same number of times that each person will speak as compared to here, but you just don't have that many responses to something. If an argument will start in the AC, it gets one response, two response, three responses, four responses. Okay, I guess that's not that bad. Or sorry, might not get a fourth response. It gets three responses, and only one of them came from the same person who made the point in the first place. If it starts in the one in the NC, well then it's got even fewer responses. This is kind of a thing that I don't think is really solvable in this kind of format, but is solvable in the way that a lot of online arguments are done, where you just have a conversational period. That's why I do like that a lot. It takes this, I do, it takes these like 3 minute cross examinations and turns them into more dialogue and more ability to confront each other. I do kind of miss these cross examination portions though. We don't get a lot of that, and because of the nature of online debates in particular, people are incentivized to grandstand and filibuster. So even if you do have a section where you're expected to ask questions, it is still considered rude to interrupt them if they just keep going on and on. Where in Lincoln Douglas that was not the case. You only have 3 minutes. You can stop them and you can just say, "Hey, listen, I only have 3 minutes. I got to get an answer from you." And if they don't answer, you can start assuming answers. In fact, that was something that was always kind of fun, even if it feels really sleazy. Is you can assume things for your opponent when they refuse to answer. For example, I had one debate where my opponent had the social contract is their value criterion, which in retrospect doesn't make any sense as a value criterion, but we were both novices. This was my freshman year, and I think they might have been a freshman or a sophomore. They were also pretty new. And I asked them, okay, well, there are a lot of different types of social contract. Is there one in particular you mean? Do you mean like the Rawlsian social contract or Locke or whatever? Because a lot of people had different ideas of this, and they answered what you might consider reasonably, like it doesn't really matter. They're all pretty much the same. What I knew is that they're not all pretty much the same. And if you're going to refer to the social contract, you should be very clear about what parts of it you're talking about. And I think it's pretty weak too, because you'd have to justify that this should be the contract that we use, right? There's a lot of stuff to go over there. But what I pointed out was Hobbes also had a social contract, and I think I misunderstood it and misrepresented it at the time, because I'm guessing that what I'm about to say is not actually accurate to what Hobbes said. But basically, as I understood it, was Hobbes was taking the position that the social contract should be maximally sacrificing from freedom in exchange for safety. And so if your government is not adequately oppressing you, it's your job to put a government in place that would oppress you. And that is pretty antithetical to when you're arguing about things like spreading democracy. I believe this was still the same contention, the same resolution at the time. Yeah, it was pretty yikes. But the judge had to side with me, because like I gave my opponent every opportunity to say that that wasn't what he meant, and I can't argue against, like, if I start to argue against a social contract he didn't mean, he can just switch to something else. I have to pin him down to something. And since he didn't agree to what, screw it. I'll decide for you. And that's kind of expected and reasonable. It seems a little slimy, even to me now. It feels a little slimy, but I think it's understandable and reasonable. Oh, I'm also quite reminded, because I'm gonna have to pause for a moment and use the restroom. But before I do, I actually, in case anyone hadn't noticed, I have a new little doodad guy in the I think it's like here ish. My little icon. It's got a bit of an update. It's got more colors in the background. It's like the finalized version. Uh, should be the thumbnail for this too. Isn't it cool, guys? But I'm gonna take a little pause. I will be back shortly. Just chill out, have a good time, and then maybe I'll get into more debate stories, because that's really what I wanted to talk about. Just like kind of talk about these little things that happened, and what I think it had an impact, how it I think it had an impact on me, because I think it did in a lot of ways, and it forms how I look at these debates. So I'll be right back. I'm just gonna put it the starting soon screen. If anyone shows up and is asking why it says starting soon, you can fill them in, but just give me a few minutes. I am back. Thanks for waiting. It occurs to me, actually, I got so excited talking about debate because it was such a big passion for me. I forgot to drink my tea. Still warm. We're good. And quite tasty. Hope y'all are still with me. And I guess the next thing I want to talk about was just kind of this constant tension that was here in debate. And I think I'm glad I encountered it here first because I was then ready for it when yeah, I do really love it, honestly. It was then I was then kind of prepared for it when I countered it in philosophy classes, and now it's very clear when I recognize it, when I see it out in the world, is this tension between winning and good debate. What might be called the difference between this tension between philosophers and sophists or sophists. I don't know what the correct pronunciation is, but basically, I mean, we know what a philosopher is: someone, at least traditionally, who loves wisdom, and who engages in doing philosophy, trying to think these things out, coming up with new ideas often. Whereas a sophist is more akin to, I might describe a lawyer as a sophist, a lawyer doing their job the way they should do and say anything to win. It doesn't matter if it's a good point. It doesn't matter if it even makes sense or if they're in the right. The point is to win. And this is pretty common, a more sophist approach. Um, and I see this all the time. I don't know that we've encountered it very much. I guess Kent Hovind is attempting that. You can argue about his quality. Maybe it's just the style. He is a good sophist for the kind of people he's trying to draw in or whatever. I don't even know if I necessarily be comfortable applying that label, but we haven't encountered very many of them. But it's a thing that comes up a lot, and a lot of people misunderstand. It's just something to be on the lookout for. I don't really have much more to say about it. Just like it's something that's come up a lot. Also, I just noticed on the side here, I wanted to like mention about note taking. So this isn't, this is just an example of what arguments might look like. Resolve Burger King is better than McDonald's. But this reminded me a little bit about note taking. We don't see it a lot in online debates, in large part because cases aren't structured well enough where you could really effectively take notes better than just jotting some stuff down on a notepad. Just like, okay, they said this thing and they said this thing, but this doesn't like, and try to remember your arguments. But in actually, oh, I should have deleted that before doing that. But in competitive debate, there was a style to it. So you would either one of two ways. I'll talk about the way I did it. Where is if you have a sheet of paper, we'll expand this to separate the sheet of paper. You have your 8.5 and 11, or preferably a legal sized piece of paper, just so you can write more stuff down. You There was a way of taking notes that would help you keep track of everything. Basically, you might put here, okay, here's the primary value, here's the value criterion. If you have definitions that you have to deal with, you put them up here. Then you have contention 1A, B, so on and so forth. And you would lay out the affirmative case in this way, then write in, generally in a different color, here's my response to each thing in the next column, then their counter, then your counter. And what this does is it lets you visually see what we're talking about. It's much harder to lose track of stuff when you go, okay, this is where we started. This was the next thing said, then the response to that, and the response to that, and you can see how the argument went and what you're responding to. Whereas a lot of these online debates, where it's just less structured debates, you don't have access to something like this, and this is why people lose track of arguments and try to say, wait, didn't you say this thing, or were you talking about that other part? That happens because you just don't have access to something like this. I don't think this is a problem that necessarily should be solved in this way, where you have this really structured case that everyone is expected to have in this fashion. But this was really useful then, and you'd have a separate sheet of paper to do the same thing on the other side of, okay, here you have the negative, and so on and so forth. There's another way of doing it where you have it laid out as a. Can I delete it from here? I guess I can't delete it from here. Can I just go to my drive? Okay, I'll deal with this later. But uh, there's another. I think I was saying there's another way of doing it, but this is the way I liked, and I do notice when people lose track of arguments, because I'm used to being able to prevent that from happening. And if people lost track of an argument in competitive debate, that was their fault. You have tools. You have every tool. Well, I mean, not always their fault. If I don't signpost and roadmap, or if my case is kind of doesn't have this clear layout, it can be my fault. But if I have all these things, if I've made it this easy for you to follow what I'm talking about, and you lose track, that's because you weren't taking notes right. That's your problem, and that's your fault. And so it becomes a little, but like, now oftentimes in debates, people will often get like really smug and annoying and upset if you didn't follow their argument. And it's like, well, maybe that's because you didn't lay it out well, or maybe it's because things were so convoluted uh, by format that we couldn't stay on point. I guess what I want to contrast this with as well is another kind of debate where you can see it's a little bit, you can see kind of the gradation of I don't, maybe sophistication is the wrong word, maybe prestige and expectation, is parley debate. Parley was what we call Lincoln Douglas debate LD for short. So what LD debaters did for fun, that was like, I don't want to try that hard. Let's do parliamentary debate, or we'd call it parley. And this was, what is it? Oh, okay, well, California high school speech association is probably good enough. Parley debate is one where, hey, it looks like me, or at least my little doodad. I really hope that I continue to not be able to get over my, like, it's a little me. He's right there. He's right down there. It's me. I'm the cartoon now. But this is what we do when we didn't want to try that hard. Parley debate was longer, weirdly, if I remember correctly. Let's see, 28, 38 minutes. Never mind. It's actually shorter. Yeah, it's 38 minutes. Oh, it used to be longer. These used to be 8-minute speeches when I did it. So it used to be slightly longer than LD, but it's, oh, the format's actually really different. Oh no, this is actually very, very different than what I used to do. Okay, this isn't going to be super helpful. Um, but you have a teammate, which is part of it, and the whole thing with parley is, well, one, it's supposed to mimic parliamentary debate in some of its style, and we'll get to that. But also, you only got your topic 20 minutes ahead of time. And if you're on the negative, you don't even know how the affirmative is going to define the topic. They could define the terms way differently than what you expect, and you're just kind of just going by the seat of your pants, just fly, just see how things go. And so this was the, like, let's just mess around. I don't want to try that hard. Let's do parley today. That was how LD debaters looked at it. I wonder if policy debaters do that with LD. I would imagine not. And if I remember right, there was another kind of debate which even the people like me who would do parley when I just didn't feel like trying that hard, wouldn't touch. I forget what it was called. It was named after some guy. It was like pretty new when I was doing it. The way it used to work was 8-minute speech from the affirmative, or I guess it's called the proposition and the opposition. In fact, it used to be called the government and the opposition. It was just all the terms were supposed to be parliament. So the each side had a leader. There was the person who spoke first. The leader of the government was called the prime minister. That was like, when you write down the speech names, you write the PM as which speech this is. Then the leader of the opposition, the member of parliament, the MP, was the other side of the government, and the member of the opposition was the fourth person. As I recall, oh no, this is correct. Sorry, I'm actually, no. This is the same speech structure. It's just they used to be 8-minute speeches, and there might have been 4-minute speeches to close. You'll notice that there is no cross-examination portion in here, because that's not how Parliament works. Parliament doesn't have scheduled question times. You just get up and start shouting at each other. So the way this worked is the first and last minute of each speech was protected time. You can't interrupt that for almost anything. There are exceptions, but like for the most part, you can't interrupt it. The middle, though, you can just get up and ask a question, and it was so much like supposed to emulate Parley that you were sorry, I shouldn't use the short version. It's supposed to resemble Parliament, that you're supposed to put your hand on your head as you stood up because you're holding your wig in place. I'm not kidding. For real, you're supposed to pretend to hold your powdered wig on your head as you get up. Otherwise, it'll fall off. But you could ask a question at any time. They could turn down the question, but it's kind of bad form if they continuously turn down questions. More reasonable is if they just said, "Hold on, let me finish my point, and then I'll recognize you." I don't know if you were supposed to say, I recognize the leader of the opposition or whatever else. Maybe? I'm not actually sure. So you get your cross-examination in the middle of the speech, which kind of helps a little bit because remember, you are expecting to fill about 14 minutes. Not quite, because you should be responding to some extent in the second through fourth speeches. But you're expected to fill this time, but you only had like 15 to 20 minutes to prepare with the topic. If you're the opposition, you might have had effectively no time because you might have been defined the resolution might have been defined differently than anything you expected, and you have to come up with stuff on the fly. So the questions actually help you fill time, and you are expected still to fill time. Uh there was another. Oh, and as a reminder, because this is all impromptu and you only have so much time to think about it, you're actually not just discouraged, disallowed from bringing in factual information. If you're citing statistics, that's a bad look, and you might get called out by either your opponents or the judges or the judge for it. Everything is supposed to be what is reasonable to expect as common knowledge. If you can reasonably think like most people know this, you can say it. But if you're citing like, oh well, actually this EPA report from 1932, or I don't even know if the EPA was around there. Like that should be way too obscure, and in fact would be a point of order. That is the next kind of interruption. Someone can just get up and announce a point of order and just say, hey, like you broke a rule, and we need to litigate that before we can move on. And you stop the time. You don't stop the time for questions, by the way, but you would stop the time for a point of order, and we litigate that. And there's a thing of point of personal privilege. If you've been directly insulted, you can stop everything and just say, hey, this guy insulted me. He needs to quit it. That doesn't happen very often, so I don't exactly know like how wacky those can get, but that's a thing. And I mentioned that you stop the time for those two things because you don't stop the time for anything else. There's no prep. Notice there's no prep time. The other two kinds of debate we talked about you have this long to prepare between speeches. You don't here. Just get up. The timer starts as soon as you're at the podium. You don't signpost. You don't roadmap. There shouldn't be anything to roadmap or signpost. The only thing you could possibly roadmap is like which arguments you're like. I'm gonna deal with the PM's argument, then the leader of the opposition or something like that. But that's also part of your time, so you don't do it that much because you have 7 minutes. Sometimes people are really unprepared. I once judged a novice. Oh, the breakdown, by the way, is for skill levels: novice, junior, varsity. So novice just means you're new. I once judged a novice Parley tournament. I would have preferred to judge LD, but my school was represented in too many of those rounds, so they didn't need. I couldn't judge my own team, obviously, and they didn't need other judges because we were too many of the rounds, so they had me help with Parley. And I remember getting very upset at the novices. I wasn't yelling at them or anything, but I was making it very clear how much they had fallen short because they were barely getting out of that 1 minute of protected time. I get that you're new, but you should have some sort of practice, and you should be better than finishing within 2 minutes. If they made it to like 4 or 5, I don't think I would have been upset. Do I prefer to judge or debate? That's a good question. I think both. I don't think I have a preference between the two. I like them both for different reasons. I think at this point, coaching and judging might be something I like better, but I also have just been away from debating for so long that maybe that fire will come back if I got to do it again. I really don't know. I think yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. But yeah, this was a very silly debate format. I remember once even. Okay, so people try to take this seriously. Maybe I was just the one guy who, well, you could either say was being a dick or knew where I was. Where I was under the impression that this was not very serious debate. We have 20 minutes to talk, like to think it over. Are you serious? Like we can't formulate thorough, good positions. We can't really think out what we want to say in any significant way because we're trying to figure out what our approach is, what we'll say, how we'll fill the time. Can't have. So I was just like, yeah, this is very silly. And in fact, there was one round where the resolution was this house believes that unilateral action is superior to multilateralism, something like that. And I was like, I'm so tired of modern politics get infecting my philosophy debate in LD that it's showing up here in this like silly form of debate where you can't like how much can you really wiggle with what you mean by these terms. Like it felt if like why am I talking about that here too? It felt I was a little put off by it, so I was like screw it. We're just messing around here. We're just gonna go completely balls to the walls, and is something that, as I understand it, is acceptable most of the time, or maybe not most of the time, but like most people are pretty like, yeah, it's parley, whatever, do what you want. I define my terms as this house, which you always have to define. Who do we mean here, right? In this case, especially in the mid 2000s, I don't remember how old I was. This might have been in my junior or senior year, so I'm not exactly sure. But maybe it was, yeah, I think it would have been junior senior, so like mid 2000s ish. Uh, the I was just like, screw it. You could normally define this house as America. That was the expectation. I said, screw it. This house is the mob, the mafia. The ones you see in Scarface or whatever. And we think that a hitman is better than like a squad to roll up and do like a drive by or whatever. And it was fun. It was a very silly round. Like it's fun to engage in these kinds of arguments that are very silly. Our opponents like did push back a little bit about the silly definition, which I think they should have. I think that was smart to do, and something like it gives you a chance to get your bearings, and if you win, if you can win out on that position, then everything we've said is useless, right? So it's really smart that they did that. But eventually they started arguing on our terms, and it was fun. You argue kind of like, okay, we're never really going to be in a position like this. It's kind of silly. The judge was not having it though. He was like, "We're at the end of a long day. I'm here judging this. You're not taking it seriously." He was so mad. He like basically awarded our opponents the win, having not listened to the debate at all because he was so upset at the way we defined things. I thought that was absolute nonsense, but like whatever. It's Parley. Who cares? It's Parley. This isn't real. Um, but like with that digression aside, I mostly wanted to bring up Parley to contrast it with what you'll see in. Did I lose my link? No, there it is. What you'll see in what are considered more serious debate formats. It's just, in particular, because Lincoln Douglas is considered less serious, I think, than policy, but not by so wide a margin as something like Parley. This is just a different kind of debate. You should be expected to give philosophical arguments, and you should be able to reason them out. And actually, now that I'm on the subject of silly things I've heard happen, or that have happened in debate rounds, I do actually want to talk a little bit about the silliness that can exist in other debate formats. I'll start with policy because these were just like really funny stories to hear, kind of as urban legends as an LD debater, because I didn't see these kinds of things happen. I have since been vindicated by a friend of mine who did do competitive policy and quite a bit of success, that no, this is the kind of thing that could and would and probably did happen. I'm not sure if he confirmed that it did. And like it makes sense given how policy works. So for example, one thing that you have in policy is your framework, basically the method by which you are approaching everything. And there was a little while where it was kind of common for people, oh, like with a lot of gaming, like card games, video game stuff, there is a bit of a metagame for debate. You'll see the same kinds of arguments, and sometimes there are different strategies that you'll see crop up a lot, and they'll be more or less popular in certain circumstances. So for whatever this resolution was, a really common framework that people were using was will to power. And they'd make their case, and it's just like always impacting to the will to power, and that's the positive good they have in the world, and or that's the like positive impact that this policy would have, right? It would it would satiate our will to power is the idea. And so what I had heard happened in some instance was the affirmative team lays out their case and has their will to power framework, and the negative is they're either going to accept it and argue within that framework, or reject it, or try to reject it and have their own framework, whatever. They say, okay, we'll accept your framework, and by your framework we can do this. And then the person the other person jumps over the table, grabs the judge's ballot. Basically, whenever the judge doesn't just like say who won, they have to like write something out so that you can turn it into the tabulation room, and also so that the after the debate, the debaters can have feedback from the judge. So they grab the judge's ballot and race out of the room, while the person who was speaking at the outset blocked the door, just physically barred people from leaving. The person who ran out of the room marks themselves as the winner, signs it, and turns it into the tabulation room, also known as the tab room or the judge's room. Then comes back into the room and says, "All right, this is what what happened and what I did." And the judge goes, "Well, it was allowed for under your framework. That's cool, I guess." And they win the round. It's very, very slick. Like, this kind of thing can happen in a lot of places and in a lot of kinds of debates. So I don't want to give the idea that only Parley is getting all wacky with it. I got rebuffed for being wacky, and it worked out very well in this policy debate. A lot of this stuff is about what you can get away with who your judge is. In fact, on the similar note, while I was a freshman, one of the seniors at my school, who was a very, very good debater, was in the finals of, I think it was a Stanford tournament. Yeah, colleges, but by the way, colleges will host high school debate tournaments very often. So it was a high school debate tournament, but it was held at Stanford's campus. And he was doing very well. This wasn't in the finals, but one of the very common strategies, or I shouldn't say common, one school had a strategy that they were trying to employ, which I mentioned previously, was performativity. The idea is we get up and debate and we talk about these numbers of like mass death and suffering, and we talk about it like it's not anything. This is maybe more the case in policy, where this is what they sound like. This is not emotive. In Lincoln Douglas, it's similar that you're not that emotive. You're more talking about what's going on, but you can be more emotive about the suffering that you're talking about, but usually not that much. And so they say, like, okay, we're doing this. Is this really about the debate? I think it seems instead that it's about the performance. And so this is why it's called performativity. And they say, okay, well, if it's just about the performance, then why do we have to be talking about what we're talking about? Instead, let's just put on a good show. And they proceed to do all sorts of things. They'd tell ghost stories. They'd flick the lights on and off. They'd throw stuff around the room. They'd like do little dances or whatever, because they're just trying to put on a good show. It was surprisingly effective. Let me be clear. A lot of people didn't know how to handle this, and the debater from my school didn't encounter this, as far as I know. Or sorry, I don't know if he didn't encounter this previously. The instance where I saw him encounter this was in like the top 4 or top 8 of the tournament. This was like pretty high up. Like this case made it quite a way. This wasn't just like, okay, a silly thing you can write off. And as I remember it, he made a pretty good argument about it. I don't remember what it was, because it was absolutely eclipsed by the chewing out one of the judges gave him. Now, this is the same judge that gave me the advice about the 2AR. Very, very good coach, I think. I'd say his name, but I don't want to dox anyone or whatever. Very, very good judge. Very good coach. I didn't have the benefit of learning from him directly. Only a few instances where he judged my rounds and he gave me some advice. But he gave them the chewing out of a lifetime of just like, we all came down here to have this debate, and like you're making a mockery of everything. Basically the same thing that I was told about Parley, but come on, that's Parley. Like, let's be real. This is LD. This is different. And this is when I did this, it was a local high school level tournament as opposed to the round I'm talking about, which was the elimination rounds at Stanford. This is not the same thing. You know, this is a very different context. There should be you should be treating it with more respect. You should like you're respecting the time of your the time and effort of your opponent, the time of your judges. At this point, I don't remember if there were 3 or 5 judges in the room, but sometimes there are even 5 judges for elimination rounds at high level tournaments. So like yeah, they were being pretty disrespectful, it was only really viable for him to do that because my teammate had put forward good counter arguments to the performativity thing. But oh boy, did they get chewed out. What's other funny stuff I'd heard happen? Oh, in policy, like I said, you have to have a proposal. You have to have a policy. You usually need that means you need to have an actor who's going to carry this out. So, for example, you might say, you know, if my policy is we should do, you know, Medicare for all, the United States government will be my actor, and is how it works, and this is what it will cost, and so on and so forth. One joking counter plan was the God and a Puppy counter plan, which is I'll do all the things you want to do, but instead of your actor of the United States government, whoever, my actor will be God, and will do what you want, but also everybody gets a puppy, and it's just better. It's silly. It doesn't really work, but it's kind of the kind of funny thing you can do. So that being said, now some like Lincoln Douglas stories that you can see that shenanigans happens everywhere. I had some wacky cases. I don't think they were good in retrospect, but I did like that I was exploring what you could do with arguments and how people were able and like kind of poke at what people are able to handle in their own head. So there was one resolution where it was resolved companies should be held to the same moral standards as people. I think that was coming up because Citizens United had the Citizens United ruling had just gone through or something like that. It might have been like shortly after that, and this is why it was on being discussed. And I didn't really have a good way of approaching this because part of the problem is that if you notice, a lot of Lincoln Douglas topics are ought statements, like the U.S. ought to do this. So there's always this implied, like, well, what moral system are we using? And it's already really hard to establish that, but then let alone to establish it in a way that is that your opponent's not going to try to like pick apart, which you could very easily. There's always kind of in the background, but with this, it's not like kind of implied in the answer to this question is what should that moral system be? What are those standards that we think corporations and people should be applied to? And to be honest, I really didn't want to try to address. I didn't really want to address that. I didn't want to try to solve this really difficult problem. And so my solution was to kind of ignore it. And what I did was I wrote a case where it was basically like, okay, what would that look like if we did? Maybe it would look a little like the dolphin safe tuna thing, where on cans of tuna, there's this little mark where if the company, you know, got that tuna in a dolphin safe way, I don't know what they do, but if they fished it for it and they in a way that's approved to be dolphin safe by whatever administration is tasked with checking up on that, then you get to put this little stamp on your label, and otherwise you don't. And consumers can look at that and say, "Oh, okay, well I want to get the one that's dolphin safe." At least that's the idea in practice, in theory. And so I was like, okay, it could look like that, and we could say what we can determine whether they are or aren't living up to these moral standards, and we have additional expectation of effectiveness here because only so many people care about their tuna being dolphin safe, but everyone cares about their morals. Kind of skirting the question of what those morals are and like, well, people have different morals and what those standards are, you know. So I'm just kind of skipping all of that to say like, well, this should be effective, so yeah, let's do it, and just not answering the question in its entirety. I don't remember how well I did with that. Probably not well, and I don't think I should have done well. But it was interesting to explore, and I like that I was trying it. And there were especially when you get to varsity level, and you your judges are usually a little bit better, so you know who they are. Oftentimes, it's seniors from other schools who just aren't debating in this tournament. There was one instance where we knew all the people in the room. Like I knew who my debate opponent was. I knew who my judge was. I think he was dating someone on my team because she was also in the room. So like everyone knew who everyone was in this room, and then like I lay out my case, and my opponent's first question in cross examination is, so how the fuck do you affirm? And I'm like, could you rephrase the question, please? It was so silly, and I was wrong. Like it was a shitty argument, but I'm glad I explored it in a similar way. The last case I ever wrote actually was a case about whether the a just government should provide healthcare to its citizens. One of the difficulties that always comes up with this, especially in America, and yeah, I don't know, especially in America, is just, well, that's expensive. People are gonna say it, and it's a really big hurdle to overcome. In retrospect, I think the best argument is it doesn't matter if it's expensive because we're talking about moral oughts, and you would have to show that that expense is so overwhelming that it doesn't matter if it's moral because it would cause additional harm or something like that, which, well, people will do. Something I alluded to earlier is that, well, I guess I didn't really talk about that much. These are high school kids, by and large, who probably don't have formal philosophy classes, let alone critical thinking classes. I certainly didn't. Who are also in a position where being hyperbolic is really beneficial. And at a time where this is kind of the rise of the disaffected, I don't really believe in anything types that are often attributed to being South Park watchers. So that the confluence of those things means that oftentimes people were talking about literally anything will cause the downfall of everything. Like it costs $20 a year, therefore the entire world economy will collapse. These are the kind of, like, it's an exaggeration, but anyone who was around at the time should know that this is not as much of an exaggeration as people might think. Basically, just it's expensive, therefore the whole world will end is really, really common in these, or at the very least was really, really common in these kinds of environments. So I guess I shouldn't say that. Maybe that isn't as good of a response, but you can argue it out and explain why you should have nuance here. My solution to the expense problem was to do a little verbal trickery. What I said was we can reinterpret the resolution, which you're allowed to do. It doesn't happen that much that you need to, or at the very least not as overtly as this, but anytime you define it, you're reevaluating what it means. And so I said we can look at how definitions are often things are often defined by their opposites. This is not true. But I said it, and people didn't know how to argue about it. And so, like, in some ways, light is the absence of darkness, and darkness the absence of light. It's a little true. It's like bordering on a reasonable statement. Sorry, I'm like looking off because I got to turn on another fan. It is quite warm in here. Is my remote not working? No. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. I'm stupid. All right. Okay, sure. And so I was like, all right, I'll redefine the resolution, and I'll redefine it to mean that as an unjust government should not provide healthcare to its citizens. If I prove that, then shouldn't I have proved that a just government should provide healthcare to its citizens? No. No, that doesn't follow. But people have a hard time explaining why. And so if we look at that, then we say, look, healthcare's really expensive. It would be a bad idea. Therefore, an unjust government shouldn't do it. This was, by the way, after a pretty traditional argument in favor of healthcare. You would say, okay, it is good for people, therefore an unjust government shouldn't do it, therefore a just government should. And people were like a little confused of why I did the turnaround at all. And then I get to my second contention, where I was reading what was sometimes the same stats as to how expensive it would be as my opponent. There was one round where they were reading their quote and realizing it was the exact quote I had read for why healthcare would be so expensive. And they just kind of didn't know what to do with themselves. They're like, do I keep reading this? He already said we. I don't know what to do. It was really fun watching people struggle with this, even though it is a pretty bad argument. And so I would say, okay, because it's so expensive, you shouldn't, a unjust government shouldn't do it, and therefore a just government should. And there are a lot of really big problems with that, but people had a hard time expressing them. Now, I don't think I succeeded very much with this case, and I think that's in part because while it's hard to argue against, it's also hard for someone to accept. And judges, while they should be neutral, this is something I would tell people when I would judge around. If you tell me that the sky is yellow and your opponent doesn't argue with you, in this round the sky is yellow. But most judges don't act like that, and I don't even know if it's necessarily good. I think in the case of practicing actual debating ability, I think it's good, but I mean, obviously, when you have an audience, they're not just going to listen to anything you say just because your opponent didn't disagree with it. If I were to say the sky is yellow when having an online debate with somebody, the audience isn't just going to believe me because they didn't argue with it. And so I think a lot of judges didn't really buy it, but it was fun watching people struggle to 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 articulate what the problems were. And I think that's in its own way good practice. This is why I like the idea of something I keep hinting at, the these are the question segments that I want to do, where we talk about silly ideas with the kind of rigor that you would commit to a real philosophical thought. I think it's useful. You should be. I think it's good to be able to argue with something like that. Now, some people might say it's useless, but like you'll encounter arguments that look at the very least similar to that. Maybe not in how silly it is, but people will say things that are more serious versions of these silly arguments. It's good to know how to articulate and to struggle through something that is needlessly weird, so that when something is typically weird, it's like training weights. You're used to it now. So I remember someone trying to argue like you well, I don't like getting cavities, but I also don't like going to the dentist. Does that mean I like getting cavities? And it's like, well, no, that means you like one more than the other, and like it didn't really give them the answer they were looking for, which was kind of funny to me. And then I guess I don't really have many other stories other than just like specific anecdotes from me. Like my coach didn't really think very much of me, so it was cool when I showed him up a few times. There was, for one thing, I don't know if you notice about how I speak. I don't know if it comes off that much or how different it is to most people. I struggled a lot with being able to speak even this fluidly. I know I still trip over my words a lot and stumble a bit. And you notice sometimes I do this pause, kind of like what just happened. I didn't do that intentionally, but I'll have this kind of a weird pause. It's because I'm trying to stop myself before I start stumbling over my words and don't really catch up. It's instead pump the brakes so that I can slow down and speak more clearly. The reason I do that is because for a long time I struggled with speaking very clearly. I used to be much worse at it than when I I used to be much worse at it than when I started doing debate, and I was pretty known for having. Oh, I guess I haven't talked about this yet. On a judge's card, on a judge sheet, not only is it the winner and loser and comments for both, it's also they also give you a score at least in Lincoln Douglas it was out of 30 for how good of a speaker you were. Where the higher the number, the better. So if you got 30, that means they think you were just a perfect speaker. I was pretty known, at least in my school, or at least on my team, of not having very high speaking points, and I was rather proud of the fact that I would very often have low speaking point wins, where I had the lower of the two speaking points between the people in the round, but I still won the round, which is rare. It's pretty unusual for that to happen, but for me it happened all the time, and I was kind of proud of that because my arguments were carrying the day, and it's something I worked a lot at, but I am glad that I got the opportunity to do that because expressing my thoughts is really important to me, and debate helped with that a lot. And it was one of the things that made, and I'm just trying to pull something up that I have off screen here. At one tournament, I don't know how well this comes through. At one tournament, I actually won the speaking award. It was the seventh place speaker. Oh, I thought it was ninth. I thought it was wasn't that high. But uh, in addition to the people who make the top cuts getting prizes, the top 10 speakers in a tournament will often get a prize. this university in particular had pretty impressive prizes. They had that mug. I don't think I have the other prizes handy, but they also had like these platters and stuff. And so top 10 speakers usually get a prize as well. And it was really cool to me. This was even in my sophomore year that I got was the seventh best speaker in the JV part of the tournament when I was known for low speaking point wins, and that was really cool to me. I still value it a lot. Now it's that classic, it's my change jar, but there are like really cool things that debate can teach you. I think philosophy is a big one. In fact, the first meeting of my debate team. By the way, debate team, debate club, not the same thing. Do not call it a club. It's a team when it's this. If it's doing competitive debate in tournament format, in tournament settings, it is a team. A club would be like we meet up at lunchtime to argue with each other. That's not the same thing. Pet peeve of mine. Uh, but yeah, the first debate team meeting I ever went to, he didn't start with my coach didn't start with what these debates like how what Lincoln Douglas looked like. He started with a small philosophy lesson. It was insufficient, I think, weirdly narrow, but really helpful. And it was an introduction to things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or Rawls's veil of ignorance, which I won't really get into here, but it was a nice introduction to that. And I think philosophy is something that ought to be taught more and better in schools at every level. It's something everyone can engage with, even at very like even a child can engage with philosophy if you provide them the right kinds of philosophy that they can wrestle with. Even something as simple like why is it wrong to hit people? A child can wrestle with that, and there are good answers that they can come up with, and it's something I think we could stand to do more of, that kind of thinking. It's an introduction to critical thinking, which I think is really good. Practicing being able to make good arguments, to be able to express yourself clearly, to get better at speaking. All of these are useful tools that, even if you never debate again, are going to be helpful in your everyday life. One thing that I value a lot is learning how to listen to arguments and understand them, sometimes in ways where uh, even the speaker doesn't. One thing I used to do all the time, because I get into a lot of nerd debates with my friends, and there would be a lot of arguments where people, especially when you're heated, it's hard to listen to each other and express yourself well. And oftentimes my role, and I really enjoy doing this, was translating what people meant. Because sometimes you say a thing and it makes sense to you, but the way another person might hear it because of the words you use, it doesn't mean the same thing as what you meant. One example that came up, not where I was translating, but I had to translate for an argument I was having with someone, was that they were using the word objective a little differently than I was. They were using it kind of like they were using it closer to what like the Google definition might be, of something that is true irrespective of the the feelings of a person, right? Where I was using it to kind of mean a fact, right? It's an objective fact of like protons move at this speed or whatever the thing is, or quarks move at this speed. That's a objectively true thing, but it's a little bit different than meaning uh than some than how he was using it. It's been a while, so I'm remembering it incorrectly. But understanding that gap is really important. It's something I think people need to get better at. And one of the things is I find really unfortunate is that I struggle to find good examples of expressing this to people. And this is something I want to do more with in my channel. This is why I like to do debate reviews, is I want to talk about where there's a disconnect between what the person says, what the person means in a way that someone else might understand it. And oftentimes you have to be talking with the listener to understand where the gap is and explain the difference. Um, Actually, a reasonable example for anyone who knows Magic is I once had an argument where a friend of mine was trying to make the argument that sneak attack isn't a red card. And that sounds ridiculous if you know anything about Magic, because you're like, what are you talking about? It literally costs red to cast. But what he means is it doesn't really fit inside the red color wheel. Now, I think that argument is nonsense, and I gave examples as to why it was nonsense. But like understanding what someone means is really a big deal. And so that's something else that like debate I think is really good for teaching. There are, however, downsides. There are big problems with competitive debate if you aren't on the lookout for them. One of them I already talked about in a previous stream, where you're because you have to argue both sides of a debate. Maybe this is less the case in policy, and definitely less in parley because you're only ever going to be on one side of a debate. Uh, well, sometimes I have a thought about that. I'll come back to it. Uh, because you have to argue both sides of the debate, there's this like cognitive dissonance is a thing you have to get around, and so at least my solution was to just walk in with this confidence and arrogance of whatever I say I'm right. I am just explaining to you why. And I found that very useful. I think I didn't carry that in very much to how I treated people in the round, but it's a risk, and it's in as much as I did, that was really bad, and I'm glad I don't think that way. I don't know when I broke myself of that, but thinking like that is really harmful. This is how you get the kind of people who treat logic like a character trait. Well, I am logical, so therefore what I say makes sense and is logical, and you are being irrational by disagreeing with me. There are a lot of people like that. And while I'm not saying it's born of doing competitive debate, it very easily can be. And that is definitely a danger. Also kind of teaches you not really to believe in things in a similar way that 4chan has been described as doing. I found the more I debated a subject, the less I had an opinion on it because I spend so much time arguing both sides of it. Now that's useful in theory, right? Because you should be able to see all sides of a position. You should be able to understand the arguments that people who disagree with you might make, but I have found since then that it's the opposite. I can no longer really argue for either side of a position in the same way. I can do it sometimes. In fact, I used to brag like, "Oh, give me any position, I'll defend it," which is a really shitty thing to do. But I had an instance where I was talking with someone I know who is a Christian, was raised Christian, but was like struggling a little bit. Wasn't really, and I don't know if he still is really sure of his religious beliefs. And with someone who was very aggressive about taking an atheist position, and just to like make the conversation more gentle and more and less of an attack, more like, hey, let's help you through these thoughts. I was helping my Christian friend with some of the answers that apologists give to these concerns the non-believer was raising. I don't agree with that, with those positions were, but it was helping him like, okay, you shouldn't like, yes, this is a problem. There are answers to this, and you should think about that and the answers to those answers, giving more information. I think that was like that kind of thing I can still do, but I can't anymore. I can't anymore be in positions like I was then, I think, where no matter the position you're put in, you have to argue against it. There was one instance that I was reminded of as I was talking about this in a parliamentary round where my teammate made the mistake of I think the affirmative define the resolution is basically saying like um was it about gay rights? I don't remember if it was about gay marriage. It might have been, I don't remember, but my teammate made the mistake of using the word appeasement. And this is what I mean about having to rely on your teammate. And I thought of another example of that, which I'll get to later. You have to trust them to both say the right things, but also not say the wrong things. And so the the other side capitalized on this and basically was like, oh, these people would appease people, and like these are the kind of people that still have me in chains. She was uh, African American, so she like it's this kind of thing where you're kind of put in a position where the implication is that I should be getting up and then arguing for slavery kind of thing, which I wouldn't do and I didn't do at the time. But even that I was willing to that I like was okay was put in a position where I only really had the choice of arguing against gay marriage, which I wouldn't. I don't. I am in favor of gay marriage thoroughly. I don't think I can do that anymore, and I'm okay with not being able to do that anymore. I think that's a version of personal growth. Sorry, I had a hair in my mouth. I think it's good to have beliefs that you stand by, not so much that you will reject arguments against them on their face, but it's good. It's good to have beliefs and to not just go where the wind takes you. Like I said, this like kind of 4chan esque. I don't really believe in anything but what I can get away with. I've been ignoring chat for a bit. Let me see if because I see a bunch of stuff going on. It's such a fallacy. So I'm like, yeah. I mean, for sure, definitely agree with that. I think you should be still. I mean, maybe I could. Maybe I could. I don't want to. If that makes more sense. Maybe I could make arguments against ideas. I believe I don't really want to, and I don't think I do a good job because in order to do it, I would have to. I would have to. It would feel too much like lying. I would have to make arguments I know are wrong. I know I have problems with. I know have flaws in order to argue against the things I believe. As long as the people you're around are mature enough to realize you're playing devil's advocate. I mean, yes, sure. So I do this sometimes. Okay. So I won't say this is a hard and fast thing. I will sometimes take devil's advocate positions, but I cannot at this point. For example, like we had an argument. We watched a debate about whether trans women are women. I couldn't go into that argument debating that no, they're not. I don't think I could do that at the very least ethically, but also I don't think I could bring myself to make arguments I know don't work and lead to people having bad conclusions. I would argue the devil doesn't need an advocate. You know, it's actually really funny. So, chat reminded me of something about the devil having an advocate. Christopher Hitchens bragged about this all the time, and I think at least one person in chat knows this story already. Christopher Hitchens really did not like Mother Teresa. He hated that she was called that, for one. I don't know the truth of the matter, but as I understand it, he like followed her career very closely and noticed that she was kind of a monster, and that simply gave off the air of being really pleasant. Things like keeping the children that she took care of in poverty because suffering made them closer to Christ. Things like that. As I understand, that's what Hitchens would say about it. I would encourage people to do your own investigation into this. Well, at some point she died, and then there was the question of her sainthood in the Catholic Church, and Christopher Hitchens was invited to speak against her sainthood. What's the word for it? It's not like deification. There is a term for it. Maybe chat can help me out. Well, it used to be that the one thing that a lot of people used to know. He tells the story so well. I would, even after me telling it, I would advise you looking up Christopher Hitchens telling the story because it's very funny. One thing a lot of people think they know about the Catholic Church is that when someone is going to be sanctified, is it sanctified? Um, that there is a position in the Catholic Church that is the devil's advocate. That's where that term comes from. That this was an actual position in the Catholic Church for people to argue against the sainthood of proposed saints. Well, he was invited in part because they had done, in an effort to streamline the process and speed up the sanctification of people, they had done away with that. They don't have the devil's advocate position anymore. And so he jokes that he was the first person in all of history to represent the devil pro bono, which is so funny. I laugh every time I hear him talk about it. I'm laughing now thinking about it. It's just so funny. What's going on? People talking about the missionary position. Yeah, people that do that are yeah. Um, but yeah, I do. Yeah, so that was a very funny story from Hitchens. Again, I think he tells it better than I did. I would recommend you look it up. But I did have another digression that we had mentioned earlier about relying on your teammate. The little bit that I did debate in community college, it was all parliamentary debate because it was a new debate team, and it was the most accessible. And so my teammate had never done debate before, and there was a lot of stuff where like I have to rely on her, but there's a bit of a skill gap. She's just not as practiced. Not that she's incapable, just currently less capable or currently less practiced and skilled. And so there was a debate where we actually made it to the elimination rounds, which we were pretty happy about, given that we were very new and a new team, and we didn't have that much practice together, and some of us at all. And the resolution was privacy is a thing of the past. And as the government, we're tasked, of course, to define our terms and what we mean by this. And what we wanted to clarify is that a thing of the past doesn't mean that it doesn't exist anymore. It means it doesn't really exist in the way that it used to. It is a bit antiquated. And we didn't have great examples from this, or at least I don't remember what our examples were. Our opponents had a big issue with that, and the whole debate revolves around this issue. Is this an adequate way of defining the resolution, which you can very reasonably argue about? And they had a bunch of examples, and so I told my teammate, I was like, listen, if you do Nothing else. All I need from you is to make some argument, any argument against this point. The kind of argument it is topicality. So just like say the word topicality, and I can handle it from there. But like I do need you to talk about it because, as I said, if I guess I didn't say in this breakdown of responses, if there's ever if there's ever not a response to an argument or a line of argumentation, it's called dropped. It's considered dropped, and it's not only considered bad form, it's considered against the rules if in this C speech, as it were, you don't talk about some argument, and then in the E speech you try to again. You've already missed your chance. Once you don't talk about it, you can't talk about it anymore. And so my teammate, um, as I recall, barely mentioned it and didn't really make much of an argument. And so of course my opponents were laying in on that of like, okay, well they didn't argue against it, so they're dropping it and yada yada etc. So I get to my speech and I start making my arguments anyway. To which of course is a point of order where they say, hey, this wasn't mentioned. And I said, listen, my teammate made an argument. The fact that you don't like it, you don't think it was a good enough argument, doesn't mean she didn't talk about it. She definitely did. It's a little hazy. And then proceeded to argue from there. Uh, I continued my arguments, and then they did another point of order, and I was like, well, it's the same point. What are we talking about? And the judges told me to move on. I think that ruling wasn't great. I think I could have handled the point of order better, but this is what I was talking about. Like, when you have a team, you desperately need to rely on your teammate. If they drop something, you might be fucked. And so there's a lot of trust that goes on there. I was reminded of the subject because I remember what some of my arguments were, because they had mentioned, oh, like camel riding is the thing of the past. People don't really do it. And I was like, hold on. Yes, they do. They just don't use it for transport like they used to. But now, you can do it for fun, or like it'd be like a nice attraction at a zoo that has camels or whatever. People definitely still ride camels, but it doesn't exist as it used to. It's a thing of the past. And it would like kind of prove my point. It was a really good argument, but I didn't get through many of them. I don't remember that one. I definitely did get to. I don't remember the subsequent ones. That was ramping up because I was going to get a point of order, so I'll start with the weakest argument and I'll get to the stronger one after we've gotten through the point of order. But as it turns out, the first time the judges, because it was 3 judges, that's why they didn't want to make a ruling the first time. They were like, they were kind of torn between themselves, so they're like, I don't know, you're kind of on thin ice, and then just left it there. And then my opponent did another point of order on the same thing, and I was like, we've already adjudicated this. You said we're cool, but I should have been more clear. I was just like, I didn't expect it, and it was like, what additional arguments can I make when 10 seconds ago we already adjudicated this? So another fun story, I guess. But yeah, like debate mattered a lot to me, and there's a lot of stuff people could stand to learn from it. This is kind of the point of the concepts document, which I will do more filling in. Again, maybe that's what I'll do tomorrow. Maybe I'll do some Sarah Zed and then also fill some of the stuff in. People could stand to learn a lot from it, but it is I would hesitate to let someone's introduction to argument, or let someone's argumentation knowledge begin and end here. This is really helpful, but it doesn't. There's a lot of problems, and I hope I've made those clear. There are some more that I haven't really gotten to that I'm sure I'll think of in subsequent streams, but I'm really glad y'all listened through me talking about this. It felt really good to talk about something that I cared a lot about for what feels like a really important part of my life, but like ultimately it was just like a few years of high school. And something I still carry with me, and I think that's really clear how I speak, how I approach things, the kinds of arguments I expect, and what I think is good argumentation. This is also why I sometimes I sometimes waffle about my evaluation of certain people's debating. Vosh in particular, who we've gone over once, and I'm sure I will go over again, because he leans. So he makes good arguments and he has good positions, but when he's in a debate, the focus is on winning, or maybe not even winning, but on convincing the audience, which is good and what he should do, but that does feel a little like sophistry. I wouldn't say he's a sophist, because outside of the context where the only possible goal could be to that the only possible goal he could have is to convince an audience. Outside of that context, he has very good arguments. His positions are well thought out, and he's happy to make sure that his positions are based on what's true and that they're justified. So in that sense, he is more a philosopher than a sophist. It's just he understands the value of sophistry in a context like debate. Maybe we'll watch one of the more ridiculous ones where we can see that in action, where like his opponent is clearly not trying, so why trying to make good arguments? So why should he? Instead, it's more important to do what's effective. Most notably, the one that comes to mind is he debated who he calls the porn Nazi. This guy who his right wing leanings are pretty evident, but also is like against, he like thinks porn should be made illegal, and what he means by porn is very ill defined. And that's a good example of like Vosh is clearly not making good arguments there, but why should he? What would the point of that be? His opponent just keeps saying that your mind is darkened, and that's why you can't understand my points. Like, it wouldn't be a good idea to make strong, philosophically justified arguments. It's better instead to discuss that outside of that setting, which I think he does. So sometimes that evaluation is difficult. So I hope people found all this discussion valuable. There are more stories from debate that maybe will come up more. I'll be like Grandpa Simpson telling his my day in this debate, this is what happened type stories, and maybe I will because I do like telling them. But I hope you got something out of this. I think for now I'm gonna wrap up, get on with my day with stuff I gotta take care of. I'm gonna try to play some Magic tonight, so gonna meet up with some people. And thanks so much for watching. If there's anything else you'd like to hear about regarding debate, also please let me know. I appreciate that people were chatting a bunch today. The more chat I have, the better I feel about it. Let me tell you. I'm mostly just jawing on here because I always feel weird just like stopping the stream out of nowhere. Maybe it doesn't feel out of nowhere to you, but for me it's like I was just talking about content type stuff, and now it's like, we're ending now, and feel weird not to like shoot the shit a little bit, vamp a bit, just kind of talk, and then before I fully sign off, I'll give you an idea of how much I value debate and how important it is in my heart, as it were. Oh, I'm noticing you can't see when I reach to my chest down here. I think I'll have to mess with where my camera is placed. Give you an idea. I still haven't finished my tea. Normally I'm done within an hour. I still have a little bit left, and it's been 2. We are finished. Still quite good. Maybe I should try this as iced tea. Maybe that would be good, because I do like this even though it was pretty cold. But I've generally found that black teas have this bitter, like this kind of burnt aftertaste when they're iced tea, and I don't really like it that much. But if I did find black teas that I liked as iced teas, it would alleviate that problem I was mentioning earlier of having it be kind of rare for me to find a tea that I like as an iced tea, and therefore trying to hold on to it. I'm glad you learned a lot, Peachy Keen. I'll be honest, that means a lot to me. I'm glad this has been valuable. Every drink is improved with ice. I don't know about every drink is improved with ice. A lot of them are. Beers. I don't know about that. Like with beers, maybe it's better when they're cold, but maybe not even iced. And in fact, there is one beer I've had where I found being colder did not improve it. It was a Deschutes Obsidian Stout. I would, have the bottle in the fridge or whatever, chill the glass, pour it, and I found it when it was just colder than room temperature, it was actually better than when it was really like ice cold. Every drink is improved being cold. Well, like I said, there are some that are not. Many teas I think are not better cold. But I in general I think agree with you. Though some people argue like, oh, it kills the flavor when it's cold, and that's why you like it more. I don't know, whatever. Like for the most part, I agree. But also context matters. If it's a really cold day out, maybe some hot tea feels nice. Though I'm also the kind to drink hot tea and hot coffee when it's warm out. It's something I got from my grandfather a little bit. One, it's just I like the heat and it doesn't bother me, but also partly, he would do the same thing. He would drink hot coffee during the summer, and people were like, "What is wrong with you? It's so hot out. You're trying to drink this hot drink." And he goes, "Well, I'm just balancing it out. Now it's hot inside, it's hot outside. It feels the same. It's like I'm the same temperature as the outside. It doesn't feel like it's hot." I don't think that's how anything works, but I love that explanation. I still use it. Uh, but yeah, yeah, I figured you would remember that, Glee. Yeah, it's like, listen, that's what he said, and I'm sticking to it. All right. Well, thanks so much for watching. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. We'll do more debate content going forward, considering that seems to be something I am uniquely able to talk about in this space. I want to go over before I'm gonna try to pull up a video before we end here. I forgot we had this.
Uses scary scenarios to shock the public, make action more popular. Jaworski evidence will be more on the link debate.
Oh, oh, that's great. It's so funny. Sometimes it would sound faster than this, but I think these examples are people being a little clearer, so it's at least moderately intelligible. And they're not doing the whole like the whole this thing, where they're flipping pages while twirling pens and swaying. But I think that's because this is a demonstration context and not a real existence context. Ooh, you know what? A 2010 Lincoln Douglas debate national finals. We're watching this. We're watching the shit out of this. And maybe I'll even teach you all how to flow. Those are the note taking that I was telling you before. Uh, we're definitely watching the hell out of this. But one thing I wanted to watch is I know there's a YouTuber by the name of Sarah Zed, and when I say Sarah Zed, I mean I'm an American and it's Sarah Z, goddammit. But I know she calls it Sarah Zed, and as I understand it, she did competitive debate as well, and that's kind of where the lead up to this was maybe we can talk about it. Uh, so this is another video. We'll just add both of these to the watch later. Uh, and I wanted to preface that with what some of my experiences looked like, with my expectation that she probably did policy debate. It's far more common, as I understand it. Maybe she did Lincoln Douglas. I don't actually know.
This
And given that she calls herself Sarah Zed and not Sarah Z, I am guessing that she's Canadian. And I say Canadian as opposed to like British or something because she doesn't have her accent sounds closer to an American accent. So maybe she's Canadian or something. And that also means that there's going to be differences of experience in terms of what kind of debate she's likely to have done and what her experiences were. So I wanted to preface watching a video like this with the understanding that my experiences are likely to be different than hers, but not because I think what she's going to say is wrong so much as it was just different context, and I wanted to explain what the context looks like from where I'm standing. I don't intend to argue with her experiences or her positions on this so much as I just want to make it clear that we may not see eye to eye, or we might still, but for different reasons because of what we saw and what we were likely to be doing. I'm not a big fan of her. Yeah, I've seen a little bit of her content, not a lot. Her style sometimes doesn't speak to me. One thing I will say that does speak to me about Sarah Zen is that she's often holding. Oh, you can't see it in these. She's often holding like a cup of what looks like tea, and I vibe with that. I feel that I vibe with that energy. Good on you. Tea is great. I'm in agreement. Is that a thing for former debaters? Where like tea is the shit? I don't know, but she likes tea. I like tea. I jive with it. It's a very silly thing, but it's something I've noticed in the few videos of hers that I've seen. I think it's tea. I'm pretty sure it's not coffee. I think she has like the you can see the tab from the tea bag, and I think she mentions it's tea. And dude, same. That's all I got. So thanks so much for watching. Now we know what we'll get into tomorrow. We're gonna do one of these, either the Sarah Zed video, more likely the Sarah Zed video, but I really want to watch that 2010 finals. Maybe we can find the 2007 finals because that's when I graduated high school, or maybe just find one where it was a resolution I would have debated. That'd be kind of cool. We should add that to. We're gonna find my Google Drive before we go. We're gonna add that to. Ooh? Is this a thing? What? I don't know what I just did there. We're gonna add that to plans for the future. which I haven't used very much because a lot of those are kind of like back burner ideas. But um, LD debates for with resolutions I've debated. That'd be kind of cool, right? It'd be quite a reach into the past because I'm old as shit, but that'd be kind of nice. Like I have some perspective on this of what we would argue. Oh, there's some stuff I didn't mention that will become. I'll hold it for when we go over some of this debate stuff. I'm remembering now. I just want to jot down to include just some of the some of the context that some other stuff that I just didn't mention. Um, and if you're interested, here's some like teasers for the future. But I believe I've vamped and jawed on quite enough. Thank all for watching. Isn't it cool? I got this new icon. Look at me. I'm all like cute and shit. I'm the cartoon. It's me. I'm the cartoon now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.